So how does it work? Well, first of all, if you look at it, tax cuts and government spending are basically, taxes are where the government gets its money. It's just like anybody has a source of income. The government gets its income from taxes. The government spending is where the money goes. And so the thing about government spending and taxation is that tax revenue has to equal government spending. Every dollar spent has to be raised as part of taxes. Now, there's a couple things going on. When economic times are bad, tax revenues go down. Like I said, people don't pay taxes because they don't work. They can't pay income taxes. And so the government is either going to have to cut its own spending and make the economic situation worse, or it is going to have to spend more than it takes in as taxes. This is something called a budget deficit. When government spending is equal to taxes, the term for that is called balanced budget. So when times are bad, the government's going to try to increase GDP by doing two things that make the situation worse in terms of the government's budget. Right? When times are really good, and this is very rare in the U.S., if the U.S. takes in more taxes than it spends, the term for that is budget surplus. Very rarely is this the case in the U.S. The last time this almost happened was in 2000 and 2001 when they thought there was going to be a surplus. And it actually never materialized because the government cut taxes before they could take in too much money. So the idea here is that when times are bad, when GDP is performing poorly, a combination of tax cuts and or government spending increases can bring GDP back up to where the government wants it to be. Now, if you think about it, this is very difficult to do anything other than cut taxes or to raise spending. People like to have money spent on things that they personally like. So generally speaking, the economy is, or fiscal policy is used in one direction. And politicians really only benefit from doing exactly what I wrote here, in cutting taxes and increasing spending. There's a term for this, it's called stimulus. So in 2009, President Obama got backing from Congress to cut taxes and increase spending, and it passed. 2009, there was $787 billion of tax cuts and spending designed to increase GDP and get people back to work. That's probably the last big stimulus you'll see. Even though people like to have money spent on them, people like to have tax cuts, people in America also worry about the fact that there's budget deficits, that anytime the government cuts its own revenue and raises its own spending, then you wind up going further into debt. So that leads us to one problem with this stimulus plan, the idea that there's a cost involved, that this money isn't free, it is paid for by the fact that the U.S. has to borrow money to do it. The other problem with this fiscal policy is that no one's ever going to really want to go the opposite direction. It is very difficult for the people in charge to do what is called austerity. And so you hear this term used a lot in countries like Greece or places in Europe that don't have their own currencies anymore. They're so tied to the euro that they wind up having to manipulate their economy to keep it competitive with Germany and other countries in Europe. And so the term austerity that you do hear about basically has to do with cutting government spending and raising taxes to control deficits. In those countries, government borrowing is such a problem that they actually had to cut their spending and raise their revenue. So you don't hear about that in the U.S. because any politician who wants to do this is going to lose whatever election they're facing. There's a classic story from about 30 years ago. Walter Mondale ran against Ronald Reagan in 1984 and said, "I'm going to raise your taxes." And he lost. I think he only won one state on the entire nation. So no politician is going to advocate for this because this is extremely unpopular. And so in the US, fiscal policy is generally only used to improve the economy in